Greetings and salutations, beautiful Amberlights, and welcome to another Saturday live podcast, where today we are unpacking science fantasy. I am so excited about this topic. Folks, you know that May the 4th is just around the corner, and so I thought this would be an amazing thing to do, to talk about science fantasy. It's such a cool genre. It is, of course, Dimitri's favourite genre. So he's very, very jealous that I didn't ask him to talk about it. I asked, of course, Chris Fox. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Janet.
Oh, it's always my pleasure. You know that I love talking to you. Now, let me introduce Chris properly because I haven't done that yet. Chris is amazing. It's basically all I can say. I can't say more, but I can sum it up with Chris is amazing. He is a novelist. He is a TTRPG creator. He is a game master. He's been telling stories since he was freaking 6 years old. He's a successful self-published author with over 20 novels which have grossed over $1 million. And he's written a series of non-fiction guides as well. So if you want to capture the secret to his success, those are available at chrisfoxwrites.com. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Whoop, whoop. There we go. There we go. I'm saying things that aren't nonsense. Those of you who were in the Inner Sanctum meeting earlier will know that I have had big old migraines since 5 o'clock, but I will try and be a normal person and say face words in the right order that makes sense. If I don't, you'll know why. Chris has just released, though, and if those of you who remember back in February, he was just about to release, well, now he has gone and done it, the Magitech RPG. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we launched a Kickstarter, which was phenomenally successful. We grossed just over $25,000. We have what's called a backer kit in place, so we're still getting donations after the fact, which gave us the funds that we needed to finish developing the game. So we are in playtesting now. We've got a very robust Facebook group where people are discussing their various campaigns and the rules, and we're releasing builds of the system. So it's just a ton of fun to watch it all finally come together. I've wanted to release a game like this since I was in high school.
Amazing. And it's based on the 9-book now, right? The 9-book Magitech Chronicles series, that world.
Right. There are currently 9 in print, and it is based on that setting, yes.
Exciting. And you told me that you just released an audiobook as well, is that correct?
Yeah, so what I tend to do is, I'm a huge audio listener myself. I bundle up my series so that you can get a complete series for 1 credit, which makes them really popular. So I put the entire Magitech Chronicles main series, that's 7 books, 66 hours, into 1 box set and release that on Audible. It's doing really well.
Holy moly. Wow. Okay, so folks, if you would like to get 6 audiobooks for 1 Audible credit, you can do that at the link that I just shared. It's the one that looks like complete spaghetti, but starts audible.com/pd/the Magitech Chronicles. You can see that over in... Just realised I've been sharing things in the Twitch chat, but not in the YouTube chat. Apologies, YouTube lovelies. Here you are. Let me share that for you. Oh, it's such a long link. YouTube doesn't even want me to share it. Well, fool to YouTube. Folks, if you go to audible.com and you search The Magitech Chronicles Chris Fox, you will find it. And it's been selling off the shelf as far as I could tell.
Yeah, I was surprised. I've had a number of ebooks and audiobooks that have been successful in the past, but nothing like the audiobook for the Magitech Chronicles.
Exciting. The final thing I should tell you about Chris Fox, particularly probably exciting for the YouTubers, is that he has his own YouTube channel. I will go ahead and share the link for that as well. What do you talk about on your YouTube channel?
I have 2, as a matter of fact. So I have a really big one that is for authors that's got a couple million views and hundreds of videos on how to be an author. And when I say how to be an author, I mean how to be a commercially successful author that is actually making a living doing this. And then I have another much more fun channel, in my opinion, that talks about world building and how to be a better game master. It also includes a whole bunch of gameplay videos from the Magitech Chronicles. So
Nice.
For our players, if they need to understand how specific rules work, they can go watch a video about how combat works or how our engineering rules or starship combat works.
Love that. Love that. More TTRPG creators absolutely have to be doing this. You have to be releasing support videos, support materials for people so they can play your game and know what to do. So I'm so glad that you are doing that. Thank you so much, Chris. Well, I think it's time for us to jump into our topic of the day, which is, of course, unpacking science fantasy. Folks who were with us last month will know that we unpacked Cyberpunk with Tobias Linder, and that was really, really popular. You guys really enjoyed that. So I thought, well, let's do science fantasy. It's an amazing genre, as I said. May the 4th is just around the corner. I'm a big old Star Wars fan. I'm bi-star, so I love both Star Wars and Star Trek, in equal measure. But yeah, let's talk about science fantasy. What is science fantasy? Not to start with a hard question or anything.
That's probably my favorite one. So science fantasy, or also known as space fantasy, takes a lot of the tropes and conventions from science fiction and then layers fantasy on top of them. So the best example I can think of is Star Wars. You've got a traditional, universe, like a space opera universe, very much like Star Trek. But the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars is Jedi. You've got that one element where you've layered in these basically magical knights and the Force from a fantasy setting into this science fiction setting, and that's what sets it apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the original notes of Star Wars, they weren't called Jedi Knights, they were called Jedi Templars. So it was really digging into this first fantasy principles of these kind of paladins, essentially, what in D&D are still called paladins. These knights with, chivalry, magical powers, and then this balance there as well. And of course, then there's also, and this is why Star Wars is such a great example, there's spaceships, but there's also magic, because I'm sorry, midichlorians be damned, that is magic, and we all know it.
Mm-hmm. That was tried to George Lucas tried to retcon that later, but I would agree. It's meant to be magic, and mysticism is something we don't understand, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes into a very interesting question, which I'll be asking later about magic systems within sci fantasy, because that is a very interesting space, essentially. Not to pun it up too much, but I found an amazing quote from Rod Sterling, who was the creator of the Twilight Zone, who said that science fantasy makes the improbable. No, I'm getting this backwards. I'm going so Twilight Zone right now. So when comparing science fantasy to sci-fi, this is what I'm trying to say. Sci-fi makes the improbable possible, whereas science fantasy makes the impossible probable. So essentially, you're taking things which cannot exist in our world, which are beyond the realms of what science tells us might be possible, and we're creating a setting with them. So you have space dragons, don't you, in the Magitech Chronicles? Is that correct?
I do, and they can fly in space. So this is an immediate problem for many hard science fiction readers when they get to the series. They're like, wait, how can a dragon fly in space? And we do explain scientifically how that's possible, but in a fantasy setting, you're not really obligated to do that. You don't have to answer to your audience necessarily every little magic spell that you've created. Whereas when you're talking about science fiction, you do have to answer how faster than light travel works, even if it's just hand waving pseudoscience. Your fans want to know that it's probable. Like Rod Sterling said, his quote is very, very appropriate, I think, to define space fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really, would you say, what makes science fantasy different from sci-fi?
Absolutely, because sci-fi is very rigid in some ways, and at least commercial science fiction these days. Whereas science fantasy or space fantasy is much more wide open, and you can tell almost any sort of story that you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are things that really blur the lines. So this was the next thing I wanted to do today. I think it's really useful when we're talking about genres, because of course genres they're very fluid to a certain term. It's very hard to say this is one thing and this is the other, because the first thing that authors do is they write a good story and they blur the lines, essentially. So I think when we're talking about genres, it's great to talk about examples which are very classic or characteristic. So I'm going to lay down some examples, and I want to hear your opinion on where they lie on the science fantasy, sci-fi, and other genres scale. Yeah? Does that sound good? Awesome.
Sounds good.
My first one, of course, is Star Wars.
Star Wars is your classic space fantasy. If you had to lean it in one more direction, like I would say more science fiction than fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. For me, it's the epitome of science fantasy. When I think of science fantasy, Star Wars is the one. For me, it's a very classic example. And how about Star Trek? Because a lot of people are sort of on one side or the other. This one's quite a contentious one, and I expect the chat is going to be humming about this one way or the other.
Well, technically, it's military science fiction. A lot of people would argue that it is a space opera, but whenever you have fiction where you've got ranks and officers and missions, and a captain and one beleaguered starship, that is quintessential military science fiction. I have 6 novels out in that genre, so Star Trek is definitely military science fiction.
That's so interesting to me because now you say it, sure, that completely makes sense, but it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't have that sort of military science fiction has a very specific feel often associated with it. Sort of grey uniforms. Battlestar Galactica to me feels like military science fiction a little bit.
If you look at the difference is tone primarily.
Exactly. You know, it's this bright world as opposed to this sort of grey and gritty world, and literally grey as the uniforms. But that's fascinating. Babylon 5. I don't know if you're familiar with that series.
Very. I just did a rewatch I think last year. I would say space opera.
Interesting. And where does space opera lie with science fantasy to you? Are they two different spectrums?
Yes. So space opera still tries to explain why its magic works. So if you look at Babylon 5 and you looked at the Tech Mages, for example, which is funny because my first novel is called Tech Mage. If you look at their Techno Mages, it might have been Techno Mages. I'm not sure what they were called, but they explained very carefully that they were using technology. And when you had psychics, they explained that they were part of this government program. Like they were very careful to give you this rigid scientific explanation on why these things were possible. It wasn't just, oh, there's mages. And I think that's the fundamental difference.
Interesting. So space opera, they really try and explain, even in hand-wavium fashion, where the magic is coming from. And what's the antithesis of that to you?
I would say probably it's going to be a flavor of fantasy, not epic fantasy, but I guess maybe that's the closest, like sword and sorcery, where I think you're going to sell a lot better today if you do give a good magic system, but you're not beholden to give a good magic system.
Sure, absolutely. Classic one, this was really where my roots in fantasy lie, Anne McCaffrey and Pern, which is a very layered space anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. Like on the one hand, I want to call it epic fantasy, but on the other, I mean, it's very much science fiction. So I guess maybe that's your quintessential science fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who don't know, Pern is a space where there are dragons flying around. It feels like a medieval fantasy space, but beneath all of that, there's a huge amount of sort of biotechnology and intentional husbandry going into creating these dragons, and they came from space, and it's a whole thing. It's a really interesting dual setting in that way, that it presents as one thing but is in fact something else. Philip Pullman's Northern Lights is another one that's often quoted as being in that science fantasy kind of space.
That's one I actually haven't read. So I mean, I'm familiar with the work because people bring it up, but I actually haven't read it myself.
It's a very interesting one because some of the core premises of the book do not exist in our world and could be called magic or magic adjacent. So, yeah, I think it's, if you're looking at science fantasy and you're familiar with that, novel series, it's a very good one to consider when you're trying to start exploring the genre, essentially. I have Demetrius in the chat saying, ask him about Stargate! Ask him about Stargate! What do you think about Stargate?
I think, well, Stargate it might be my favorite setting that I didn't create, like my outside of me, like the one that I love the most. I still remember seeing the movie in the theater in 1994, right when I turned 18. It was just amazing. It had such a huge impact. It's science fiction. There's nothing in there that's fantastical or magical. Everything is very explainable. So you could also make a case for it being military science fiction, but I would say probably, like if I had to nail that down in a genre, I would say adventure science fiction.
Interesting. But then there are these portals to other worlds that really, are so fantastical,
But they tell us how the portal works. So like if it was a magic gate and they stepped through it and they had no idea how it worked, then we'd have fantasy. But because it's like, okay, it's creating wormhole, here's how it creates the wormhole, here's how the gate addresses work. We know much more about how the system functions.
Interesting. I love talking about this kind of stuff because I think our audience, and even me to a certain extent, are seeing where the lines are drawn. And that's why I love bringing up examples when we're talking about genres, because it really, that's such an interesting space. And the final one I have on my list is Doom. You battle the forces of hell with guns?
That is an excellent question. There's no magic. Well, actually, they throw fireballs at you. That seems very magical to me. So I would say space fantasy because they're not explaining anything. You're picking up guns that could not in any way work in the real world, and you're blowing up demons that couldn't exist in the real world. We're using abilities that couldn't exist in the real world, and they make no attempt to explain any of it. But it's really fun.
Okay, well, there we have some common examples unpacked of science fantasy. So we've talked about what it is, and we've talked about some common examples. Let's talk about common tropes, because I think that's another great way to get more familiar with a genre. What do we expect to see in a typical science fantasy? What are the tropes we're talking about?
So the beauty of this is a typical science fantasy is broad, and you get to pick. What is your starting point going to be? Do I want to start with fantasy? Do I want to start with science fiction? If I start with something like science fiction, then you're going to pick a general setting and set of tropes. So like maybe I've got the beleaguered captain and the one starship and, you know, a crew aboard it. And then you're going to add your twist to it. And so in my case, that starship might be powered by magic. So instead of flying a ship that has a warp drive, you're flying a ship that has a spell drive. And the pilot has to have a specific type of magic, in my case, void magic, which they use to open a portal into the umbral depths, which is a shadowy plane that underlies our existence. So, you know, your tropes that you're picking, you start with one that is very well defined, like let's say military science fiction, and then you like look over to like epic fantasy and say, ooh, I like dragons and I want magic swords, and you can sort of drop that in. So you have much more freedom. Like, you know, think about Doctor Who as a great example. There's no story you can't do in Doctor Who because really that is science fantasy at its core.
Yeah, that's a great example that I hadn't thought of actually. With the magic screwdriver that fixes everything and is never explained and all this stuff. No, absolutely. Lots of people shouting about Spelljammer in the chat. D&D Spelljammer. If you're
I would call Spelljammer the very first epic space fantasy. So I advertise the Magic Chronicles as epic space fantasy, and the reason I do that is because Spelljammer is a thing. For those that don't know, 6 novels came out in the late 80s and early 90s. They were written by different authors, so they tried to do this really ambitious thing where book 1 and book 6 are being written at the same time by different people. But it was a fascinating setting where all of their ships were powered by magic, and they didn't have technology per se. So when you left your planet, you went into the ether, and so you couldn't actually breathe in the ether, but it wasn't kind of the same thing as space. So it's a really, really interesting setting, and I think it's inspired way more culture today than people are aware of.
Interesting, very cool. I'm actually not familiar with Spelljammer, so I will definitely go and check that out. So what we're saying with tropes, essentially, is it's a little from column A and a little from column B. You take your basic fantasy tropes, the ones you like. You're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we had this? Wouldn't it be cool if we had that? And then you take some sci-fi elements and you just kind of make a cocktail with it. Is that what you're saying?
That's it exactly. Your audience, odds are good, has now seen a whole bunch of fantasy and a whole bunch of science fiction in their life. They are familiar with all these IPs. You get a whole bunch of tropes for free where they're familiar with settings and situations. And so really what you're doing is creating a few unique ones that people have never seen before and then reusing a whole bunch from multiple genres in a way that they find pleasing. And then your audience will love it. You know, Stranger Things, there's not much original about that, but we all love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to be said, and I'm sure Chris will double down and tell me why, but there's a lot to be said for presenting something familiar in a way that makes it seem just a little bit new. And audiences love that. Audiences, they don't always want you to reinvent the wheel. What they want is for you to tell a great story with something that they can really connect to. And using these tropes together from the two spaces is a great way to do that, you know.
Yeah, we've all read The Wheel of Time, but if you jump into, say, Brandon Sanderson is a wonderful example, and Roshar, his setting is so alien and unique and different from what you've seen before that's going to re-engage people. If you look at Brian McClellan with Flintlock Fantasy, you've got mages that are snorting gunpowder to power their magic. I mean, it's about coming up with something new that is going to evoke the same sense of wonder that we as fantasy readers used to have as kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And science fantasy is a great avenue for that. It's a space that people, again, with the space puns, sorry. It's a genre that not a lot of people are embracing. While you have huge amounts of people writing fantasy, there aren't so many people writing science fantasy. And I think it's a really good opportunity for people who want to go into a new area, who want to explore a genre. It's a great one to go into because you don't have to have huge amounts of scientific knowledge to make it sound authentic. It's fantasy. It just has to be exciting and credible within your setting, essentially.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. So we've talked about what it is. We've talked about some common tropes. Do you have any favourite tropes from that you like to use in your own science fantasy?
The whole hero's journey, to be honest. I'm so in love with that because I feel like that's a language that we can share mythological values with future generations that don't even exist yet. And so I love telling stories that maybe, you know, a century from now, some kid will pick up and read it and get something out of it.
Amazing. So I feel like we've touched on this a little bit already, but I'm going to jump in with it because it's a question I always like to ask. Where do you start with science fantasy? Where do you start the world building, and where do you start the storytelling? Whether that's TTRPG storytelling or whether that's novel writing.
I start by picking a proxy. So you're going to pick kind of a tech level. Let's say do you want your universe to be more like Battlestar Galactica or Mass Effect, or some sort of steampunk fantasy that you're familiar with? Like, you're going to sort of pick something you're familiar of, and then you're going to twist it. So in my case, with the Magic Chronicles, I said, okay, I want a universe that's a little bit like Mass Effect, with a whole bunch of, you know, galaxy-spanning empires and races and ancient technology and ruins and archaeology. But I also want dragons and magic and gods. And so the first step that I had to do is say, how can this universe exist? And so I decided, okay, there were these ancient gods, they created everything. They got into a war and they wiped each other out. And now these bodies are scattered across the cosmos. And then you turn on your inner 5-year-old. Okay, well, why? Well, when you look at these catalysts that are left behind, if mages come to them, I decided they can take a bit of the power and gain magic. So now you have to ask yourself, if this is possible, well, what can they gain from magic? And how would that magic affect the economy? And what sort of resources or powers would it give them? So if they have a life catalyst, and that's the only place where you can go for magical healing, what sort of economic avenues does that give that society versus the demons over here that control the void catalyst? And as a creator, as you start to kind of sketch out this general framework and understand the shape of your system, little details will almost fill themselves in. It's really about finding that initial big hook that separates your setting from the other settings that maybe you're trying to emulate a little bit.
So a unique selling point, essentially. That's what you're looking for. That
effectively
sort of bringing them in, you know?
Yeah, so if you were to say, what is the USP of Star Wars, it's Jedi.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Demetrius, who is in the chat right now, had a friend who wrote her thesis on the fact that all truly great franchises have, now let me get this right, ninjas, pirates, Nazis, and... No, I think that was it. Ninjas, pirates, and Nazis. So you have the ninjas, who are kind of the Jedi, and they have their ninja powers. You have the Nazis, who are the
Empire.
The Empire, exactly. And then you have the pirates, who are the rebels. All of a sudden, you get this this amazing space. Yeah, the ninja pirate Nazi theory. This is.
I would love to read that. I'm going to have to find her thesis and read that.
And it's a retelling of this trope: ninjas, pirates, and Nazis. They behave in certain ways that we expect, but they're reskinned to tell a different kind of story. They have a different kind of tone. They have a different kind of flavor. So we are re-engaged. And yeah, absolutely. It's finding the USP for your ninjas, pirates, and Nazis, or finding the USP for your Starship Voyager, or whatever you're doing. Essentially, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's the start point, and everything else will really grow out of that, where your USP will become a thriving universe with like rich world building, and that's the USP will get fans to come, and the rich world building will get them to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you put it all on World Anvil and keep them hooked between books, and yeah,
that's where mine is.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I love bringing Chris on, because not only is he eloquent, not only is he knowledgeable, not only does he know about a variety of subjects, but he's also a World Anvil author, which means he's part of the family, and I love it. I love it. Okay, so let's, just before we jump to our audience questions, talk about how do we tell interesting stories with science fantasy? Where are those areas of interest? What kind of stories are we telling? What kind of stories are even suitable you mentioned the hero's journey. Is that all that you can tell in science fantasy, or are there other kinds of stories as well?
The beauty of science fantasy over maybe science fiction, although even science fiction you can really do this too, is you can tell any story. You can do everything from an Alamo Last Stand to exploration to anything you can think of, and you can set it, in some corner of a universe somewhere and tell that tale. What's going to make people interested in that story is two things. First, powerful characters. You need great characters who are believable and want real things that the audience can understand as they're reading it. And if you have those, then people are going to start looking at the world and getting more interested. But the characters are the lens through which they see that world. So no matter how cool your world building is, if you don't have good characters, they're not going to stick around to see it. So you create that lens of characters, and then you show them the really cool stuff, the USP that your universe has that others don't. You show them your Jedi.
Amazing. Amazing. So build great characters and let those characters tell a story and interact with your amazing world, essentially.
Yeah, effectively. I mean, and obviously it's a lot more complex than that, but if you're boiling it down to its essence, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I guess for TTRPG players, it's exactly the same. It's create compelling villains, create an intriguing plot, let your PCs explore, and show them the USP of the world as part of that plot, as part of that mechanic.
Yeah, and then just let them take it and run with it. So it's really about just giving them some avenues, and if you've got an interesting enough story, they're going to resolve it in a way that probably you don't expect.
Yeah. Well, that's what players specialize in, isn't it? What do you think are the biggest problems? Like, what are the common errors with science fantasy? Where do people go wrong, do you think?
Well, there's no set, do it this way. So if I'm going to write a military science fiction, I know the core of what I'm putting together. I know exactly how to appeal to my audience. I know that if I don't get my military ranks correct every single time, and my ballistics correct every single time, I'm going to hear about it. But with space fantasy, there's no guidebook. There are series that take completely different approaches to what space fantasy or science fantasy are. And so you take a chance whenever you write science fantasy. So my original series, the first book is called No Such Thing as Werewolves, which sounds like fantasy. But in reality, it was my attempt to scientifically explain how werewolves and zombies and all these other mythological creatures could exist. And so it's got a very heavy science bent. But because I didn't advertise that fact on the covers and in the marketing, it wasn't clear to the audience that I was trying to reach, and that series didn't do too terribly well. So the risk with space fantasy or science fantasy is if you don't hit the intersection well, your series may not take off. It's harder to do right, but it's so much more fun when you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So really making sure that you're capturing your audience, really capturing what they're looking for, essentially. And
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say an experience that they're going to greatly enjoy, enough that they want to come back for more.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you do that? How do you figure that out? What they're gonna enjoy? Because I guess science fantasy, when you're making it, you're getting audience a little bit column A, a little bit column B. You're getting mainly fantasy writers and mainly sci-fi writers, and they're sort of coming together. I don't think there's a massive science fantasy audience per se, or maybe I'm wrong.
There is now. It's growing and growing rapidly. I've been I don't want to say taking advantage of, because that sounds bad. I've been servicing that market for a few years now, and it's growing quickly. And part of the reason is movies. So there aren't a lot of books about science fantasy, but The Avengers is quintessential science or space fantasy, because you've got Iron Man, who is the epitome of technology, alongside a literal Norse god. Doesn't get any more fantasy than Thor.
True.
So people love The Avengers. It's become very mainstream. Star Wars is also very popular. So you've got enough grist there that when they see something that is clear to them that this book is going to be space fantasy, they're curious. Also, I would argue that Warhammer 40K has had a massive impact globally on the space fantasy genre, and that lots of people want to see more stuff that is not Warhammer but is kind of similar.
Sure, absolutely. And that is Warhammer but written well, I guess, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have not read them, but I've heard a lot of complaints about the Warhammer novels, that they are just not very well written. This is what I have heard. I have not read them myself.
I've read quite a few of them. I like Dan Abnett. He's one of their flagship writers, and so he does a fair number of them. They're pretty good, but They're dense. They're very, very dense, and it's difficult for most people to get into them because of the language. It's just so alien from our own world. You're hearing a lot of things about heresy. If you're into the setting, it can be amazing. But like, if you're just a standard science fiction and fantasy reader, go read Dune.
Yeah. As Daisho Chikara says in the chat, more stuff that is like Warhammer, but not so bleak.
Yes. The tone for the Magic Chronicles, for anybody curious, is much more hopeful. I have a happy ending in this series. I like happy endings. I don't mind there being some bad things occurring, but most people should live, and I generally like it when the heroes win.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'll punish them as much as you can imagine, but at the end, they're gonna earn their happy ending. But they're gonna have a happy ending. That's what I like to. That's how I write. So yeah, I respect that. Well, I think it's time to jump to our audience questions, and blimey, there are a lot of them. I didn't even tell you this, but if you would like to ask a question, you could write in capital letters question and then your question, and we might answer it right now. There are a lot of them, but if you sorry, I lost the thread there. If you ask an interesting question, then I will pose it to my amazing guest here. First one, very, very good question. How much science is too much science for science fantasy?
I would argue that you have to go really far for it to be too much. The more you explain, the more the audience that I'm hitting loves it. Because the core of the audience seems to be more science fiction and less fantasy, and they love their science. They love that crunch. So if you can present it in your setting in an interesting way, they're all about it. They don't necessarily want pages and pages of exposition, but throwaway descriptions of how systems work. So like, for example, in my setting, I have quantum for communications. I don't have to say anything else except for quantum, and you're like, oh, it's quantum entanglement, and they're somehow using it to communicate. Yeah. Simple shorthand like that is enough, I think.
Sure, absolutely, and finding those tricks to get things across without a huge paragraph. Yeah, absolutely. Daisho Chikara says, how would you approach top-down versus bottom-up world building for science fantasy? Good question.
So when we say top-down, like, am I creating a planet or a galaxy or a universe?
Yeah, so exactly. So it's sort of like start at the edges of your scope, and in the beginning there were gods, and gods created stuff.
Yeah.
And
I love that, and it's actually how I approached my setting. I decided there was a god named Om. For those that are unfamiliar, monks that meditate, they make the Om sound. Well, that's supposed to be the perfect cosmic sound. I'm like, okay, well, that's the name of the creator god. Huh. So the creator god was all that existed, and he was really bored, because if you know everything, do you really know anything? You know, there was nothing else to interest him, and he, didn't really have anything to occupy his time because time didn't exist. So he fragmented off part of his consciousness and created an area of space where he could not automatically perceive. And then he let these new beings he created out of his own consciousness go there and do things so that when he showed up, it would be interesting. He effectively created television. So when you're doing your world building, you want to think about something like that. And everything that you're creating is going to flow from that. So in my case, this led to a God's War, where the creations from this first original creator god became elder gods and titans, and they brawled back and forth, and there was a huge war. And so all of my history sort of flows from this. I created something called the Great Cycle. You've got the dream world and the spirit world, and they kind of flow around ours. So energy starts in the dream realm, goes into the mortal realm, and then when you die, you go to the spirit realm, and then it kind of starts over. So all of these world building elements come out of looking at things from top down. So think about your creation. How did the universe get started? Is it similar to ours? Is it different? Is there some neat twist you can do that people haven't thought of?
Very cool. Very cool. And that, again, that really helps you building that unique selling point that's really going to hook people in. The chat is now full of Om. I would like to tell you that Om is a fantastic sound because an O, it was a partially occluded vowel, I used to be an opera singer, gives you a full zygomatic engagement, and the M, which is very loose, keeps the tongue in an engaged but relaxed position. So it's the perfect sound for getting the most vibrations from your face. I don't know.
I'm gonna steal that and use that in the next Magitech book.
It's for you. It's a very good vocal warm-up sound. Yum is also very good, in case you wondered. I quite like the idea of profiterole monks that use yum instead, but
yum
as they meditate on the essence of deliciousness in the world. Okay, a question from Invictia who asks, what genre is Gundam, generally speaking?
Gundam Wing.
Can you explain to the boys and girls in the chat, what is Gundam?
Mecha, the original mecha. So if you think of Veritex from Robotech, if you think of giant robots that can transform, that was sort of where it came from. I would say military science fiction. Most of the stories in the Gundam universe are a military unit trying to acquire supplies or get their Gundams and get into battle and win something. So it reads very much like military science fiction, but you could hear an argument that Japanese anime is its own genre because the conventions for anime are different than standard science fiction. So I put it into one or the other.
Cool, very cool. And on the same vein, General Cross asks, where on the scale is altered carbon?
Wonderful setting. It's funny because I would argue mostly it's cyberpunk. Like its core is cyberpunk, and sure, we've got the universe at large and multiple planets, and it's got more tech, and it's a little bit further in the future than what we're used to. But that's like the quintessential cyberpunk.
Yeah, post-human cyberpunk. That's exactly what I would say. Good. I'm glad. It's always nice to have my opinion vindicated by an expert. That makes me feel good. Anthony Stroyama says, Strohmeyer, I'm guessing here, says, is Spelljammer science fantasy or something else? And why?
So Spelljammer is epic space fantasy because it is epic fantasy at its heart. You've got one character in that 6-book series who is going from literally he's a farm boy to he's one of the most powerful characters in the setting by the end of book 6. So the space part is being appended because most epic fantasy doesn't leave the planet and go into space. So epic space fantasy is not like an official genre, but that's what I call it.
Right, absolutely. I mean, all of this stuff, it's like I said before, we talk about genres as if they're fixed things, but all of this stuff, like, if there's one thing authors love to do, it's find unique things. It's right between the lines. Pern, which we think of as this sort of traditional science fantasy, archetypical science fantasy, was groundbreaking. It took this looks like a fantasy and said, aha, no, that's science. And that's how genres are born. So yeah, expect this. And in 50 or 100 years, people will be sitting down on their flying cars on Twitch probably, because some things never change, and they'll be talking about new genres that don't exist yet, which will have crystallized in the last 100 years. Genres are zeitgeist. They're crystallization of ideas into a form that several people have followed enough that it's become a trend, right? So genres they're not solid things. So
like all fluid things, I mean, they change over time. So if you've got a genre and we all decide today, okay, this is what lit RPG is, in 10 years that definition is going to change.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really does reflect the times, I think.
Yeah, and it's all about, we can sit down right now and tell you what the market's doing. Well, Chris can tell you what the market's doing, and we can unpack examples that are to hand, but this will be different in 5 years maybe, as something groundbreaking comes out and changes the way we think about stuff. That's great. It's really exciting.
Yeah, it's fun that it's constantly changing. I think it would get boring otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've answered how much science is too much. The answer is there's no such thing. How much science should be in science fantasy? So when is there not enough science?
If you are not explaining basic, fundamental conventions that are present in science fiction. So like if you look at Star Trek, they can fly faster than light because of a warp drive. If you're not mentioning why your ship can fly faster than light, then your fans are going to get upset. So you need a bare minimum of hand waving to explore core systems. If you have communications, are they using a comm unit? How does that comm unit function? So you have to at least answer the basics, but really you don't need anything beyond that. You can get away with almost no science. One of the interesting things about my Magitech Chronicles versus the Void Wraith series, Void Wraith has realistic physics on how long it'll take them to fly through a system. Whereas in the Magitech Chronicles, they always arrive within minutes wherever they need to be because cinematically that's a lot more fun.
Right, absolutely. So I guess it's personal. It depends on the kind of story you're telling, and like with all of these things, it's a spectrum, right? So you can be very fantastical science fantasy, or you can be quite sciencey science fantasy before you get off the edge of that genre into another genre, through the genre spinning door of wherever we land. There's a lot about naming that is important, I think, in science fantasy. It's that veneer of science. So yes, we have a dilithium-powered hyperdrive. What is it? I don't know. It could be a chocolate teapot. Who knows? But it's called a dilithium-powered hyperdrive, and that is the important thing. So it's as much about MacGuffins and plot and flashing lights that you're not quite sure what they do, but you've been told that they're important, so that they're there. That can be enough if that's what you want to do. If you just want to write fantasy in space, go for it. Go for it. Just add some dilithium-powered doohickeys so that you've got your audience along with you. If nothing else, it is a pointer for genre. And that is really helpful when setting up expectations and promises during your novel, right? So if you're in a complete fantasy setting and aliens come out the woodwork, you're going to lose your hardcore fantasy writers. If you establish that it's a science fantasy setting and then aliens come out the woodwork, you're right, your readers are going to be fine with that. They knew what to expect, and it's delivered. And yeah.
I have a cautionary tale. So Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman wrote the Dark Sword trilogy. I don't know if anybody's read that. Probably not. It was one of their least popular series, and the reason for this is you start out with a character in a world where everybody has magic, and he ends up with a sword that he forges that will absorb magic. So he has no magic, and that's kind of his claim to fame. Well, all is well, and it's a pretty good series, but you get to book 3, and magic tanks start rolling in. Oh. I'm sorry, not magic tanks, actual tanks, like regular tanks. And you're like, wait, what? Oh. Where did these come from? Well, it turns out that this universe is like in one little corner, and this huge, massive interstellar empire has been trying to conquer it, but there was no foreshadowing. So all of a sudden, you just got tanks on the page. Yeah. And it was really jarring, and I think that series, it really bombed if you compare it to something like Dragonlance or the Deathgate cycle.
Right, exactly. And if you don't establish your tone, if you don't establish your genre, and you foreshadow those promises of what will happen, audiences don't like it because it's jarring, it's incongruous. But B, audiences like to feel just a little bit smart. Like, you're going to keep them with you if they're like, oh, he mentioned that, and now something's happening with it. Oh, I remember this. And that's the same whether you're writing a novel or playing a TTRPG campaign. You set down seeds. I can see the great GM is in the chat, so I'm going to use his terminology. You lay down those seeds, and you let those seeds grow, and your audience is happy because that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's not rocket science. Particularly if you haven't foreshadowed it to be rocket science. Then it's definitely not rocket science. How big can science fantasy get before it becomes epic fantasy? Where's the red line?
The scope of the story. So epic fantasy is usually a sweeping epic, meaning that not only is it long, that's one of the definitions, but also it's probably going to encompass a lot of multiple points of view.
Yeah, so you see lots of POVs, usually. My feed is slowing down a little bit, sorry about that. You see a lot of different POVs, and generally you see, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that the definition when you're talking epic fantasy in sort of fantasy terms is that it's bigger than the scale of one person and their own story. You start to see things on a scale more sort of nation size, and that scope of storytelling. You're seeing just a bigger area being explored as well.
Right, and the problem is that it grows out of the term epic, like from the epic Gilgamesh, for example. And so nobody can agree on exactly what it means, but I think your definition is probably the closest to what it actually is.
Yeah, it's the definition that I use when I'm trying to explain it on the YouTube channel. So that's good. Lots and lots of chat in the chat about tropes, and a question from Sharon Beatty, who asks, some people think tropes are bad. Why do you think that is?
They assume, and I wrote a book called Right to Market, which is very contentious in the author community. Most people love it, but you could see what would upset some people. Tropes are synonymous to some people with selling out, because you're not using the artistry of creating your own story. You're using other people's. And what they don't understand is, no, you're a chef and these are ingredients, and you're choosing what proportion to use the ingredients in, and when to add them in, and how to stir them, and what temperature to cook them at. So it's part of artistry, and I think tropes are tremendously useful in that regard. They're not necessary. It's just shorthand for situations and objects that appear in stories. The Enneagram is another example. So if you're dealing with academics and you use the Enneagram, that's going to be much more accepted than, say, tropes. But ultimately, the Enneagram just breaks personalities down into 9 different trope personalities.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know what that is, the Enneagram is the sort of INTJ. Um, that was just a bunch of random letters. I'm not very familiar with the thing, but it's essentially personality types.
Sure.
Right.
So as an example, you've got the achiever, that's going to be there in any given scene, what they're trying to do. They want to always be the maximize, achiever. You have the peacemaker. And so each of these is explained and you'll learn a little bit about what their personality type is. I find it way too limiting. I find freeform tropes are much more interesting and easier to use. I love learning new tropes. And there's nothing to say that when you write a trope, you have to use the trope in question. So you can see a trope and then write whatever you want based on what, how that inspired you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to say that tropes are wonderful because they lead your audience to certain expectations. We talked about promises before in narrative, and again, this is whether you're making an RPG or whether you're making a novel. This is absolutely really important stuff. You make promises in your narrative. You set things up. You set up expectations. The way you carry those expectations through or subvert them is what's telling a great story. So, I was going to use my first book as an example, but I won't because it's a big spoiler. So I will say that at the beginning of a story, if you see, or at the beginning of King Lear, if you see, okay, the third daughter is oppressed by the other two, and she's the one that is the true heroine of the story, and you start King Lear, you're like, okay, she's going to be the heroine because she's basically Cinderella. What if she turned out to be the bad guy? This is the power of tropes. You set something up and then you can do with that whatever you want, but by setting it up, you can guess what your audience is going to be thinking. Essentially, you're giving them signals, and the way that you go with that is what was going to make your narrative very engaging. So based on that, I think tropes are very, very valuable because they're just a way of setting up expectations which you can then do things with.
And you get so much for free because your reader is creating all this imagery in their head the moment they think they see a trope.
Yeah.
Oh, the heroine just picked up this powerful magic sword. They're going to start making a whole bunch of assumptions right off the bat, no matter what you put on the page, and then you sort of get to guide that flow.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's valuable just to have a shorthand, and sometimes you want to do something with that trope that is unexpected and take your reader on a journey. And either way, you get a lot for free with a trope, Great, lots and lots of questions piling in. That's fantastic. A great one here from Christopher Dravus, who asks, it seems like a lot of science fantasy hinges on the element of space. What other science anchors would work if you don't want to use space? For example, I use underground in one of my science fantasy settings.
One of the more popular ones that I see is post-apocalyptic, works really well. You also have the supernatural investigation organization. So, maybe basically modern times works really well. You could even jump back to ancient Egypt and work in some technology like Stargate style and have a planet, where you are totally moving the setting there. So you have a lot of latitude to set it wherever you want. Like Stargate, even though at first, like in later seasons, we went into space and they had spaceships, but at the very beginning, there were no spaceships. It was just this portal that took you to another planet, and everything else that existed was just normal stuff from the normal world. So you can pick any setting. It could be the jungles of South America, where there is a proto-arc in the jungles that is really behind the mythology of El Dorado, the city, and your characters are going to go investigate that.
Yeah, the ancient technology trope is a very good one if you don't want to get involved in space immediately. I would also say a fantastic science fantasy setting, which I didn't think of or even mention earlier, I don't know why, is the Shinara Chronicles. Where you have elves and dwarves and orcs and gnomes, but actually they're all have humans as their ancestry, plus a whole bunch of mutation. And so what you have there is treasures from the past and apocalypse, and they're dealing with scientific things and they're tinkering with things that they half understand. It's not terribly futuristic, but it is absolutely, in my opinion, science fantasy.
Yeah, it has nuclear missiles in it. I mean, it definitely is science fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. That is on Netflix right now, at least it is in the UK. So if you're not familiar with it and you want to jump into TV series before you sit down with the books, it is a faster way to consume it. The series, it's nice. It's got a lot of pretty visuals, and it's
I enjoyed it. So like if you're a fan of the books and you wanted to follow the books, it doesn't, but that's okay. Like the TV series is energetic and fun if you give it some room to breathe.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have not read the book, so the series was my first experience of that world, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very interesting telling, um, and not badly made in terms of all of the sort of technical bits and bobs. Um, let's see. What are the biggest or most used cliches in science fantasy? Asked Daisho Chikara.
Laser swords,
Laser sword.
for obvious reasons. Like the number of people that I know that have invented, this includes Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, in a different setting they did. It basically created lightsabers. We all love them, and so people were always trying to bring them in. I have spell blades, which are very similar. So, I think that's the most common cliche in almost every space fantasy setting I've seen.
Awesome. Are there others as well, do you think?
The core of a ship overloading.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's in any space genre, I think that is a thing. The core will overload and you're gonna get bits everywhere. Even in dragon butts. It's gonna happen. The one that I like is different races. Because again, like if you're writing science fiction, often you're telling stories about humans in space. Like The Expanse, for example. The minute you're in science fantasy, you're starting to look at different kinds of aliens, space creatures, because I think a lot of science fantasy is digging into that wonder, right? It's like sci-fi, but you're keeping that wonder. And those of you who were in our talk a few weeks ago about how to keep your world building wondrous in any setting, will absolutely recognize a lot of the elements that we've been talking about today in terms of, really making the world feel big and wonderful. So
at its heart, I think the reason why epic space fantasy is working for me with the Magitech Chronicles is that exact reason. My audience are people who have read The Wheel of Time, and they've read George R. R. Martin, and they've read Brandon Sanderson, and they've seen fantasy done a whole bunch of different ways, and now they can get a similar coming of age hero's journey experience, but in a completely new universe without sacrificing dragons or magic or gods. People really just want to see the same kind of stories in a new setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? That's how humans have been for a very long time. Again, I'm always talking about it. The Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. It's solid, people. Beowulf and Jaws. It's the same story. What can you say? Fantastic question from Meloy Melu, who asks, is it science fantasy if I don't include magic?
It doesn't have to be called magic per se. If it's something that is unexplainable in the way that magic is, if it's fantastic and wondrous, then I think you could still fit that definition. It's when that stuff is rigidly explained that you're losing the fantasy aspect.
Sure, absolutely. Again, midichlorians, case in point.
Great example.
Yeah, they say they're midichlorians, but they are magic. Psionics is another very good example if you have a psionics system. They call it psionics because they don't want to say it's magic mind reading. And again, that's one of those dilithium-fueled injector cord doohickeys. It's a chocolate teapot. It's mind magic, and they're calling it psionics because it's just, giving it that veneer of something explicable, which is magic.
Right. We haven't completely as a species ruled out that, ESP and psionics exist in mankind. And so the theory is if you had some sort of government program and you gave people enough drugs, you could create a river town.
Yeah. If you give people enough drugs, I think a lot of very bizarre things would happen. I live in Croydon, though, so I would say that. Matt Levington says, do you have any plans for planning a larger series in regards to combining the overarching series plot with the individual plots?
Oh my God. Someday that would be amazing to do, yes. At this time, I have not plotted that out because that would just be a nightmare. So I think what he's referring to is my Deathless series, my Void Race series, and my Magitech series all appear to be in different universes when you pick the books up. And as you read them, you find Easter eggs, and eventually fans piece together they are all, in fact, in the same universe. And so I think they're looking for a master tie that'll tie all my series together.
It's going to be the ultimate crossover, essentially. Oh, people love crossovers. Crossovers are great. Fantastic. So, I think we're just about to wrap up. I have one final question for you. Is science fantasy only for hard magic systems?
Not at all. You can do a very soft magic system. For example, the Force.
Right.
They don't really explain anything about how the Force works in the first trilogy. It's literal hand wavium.
Literal hand wavium, right?
These are not the droids you're looking for.
This is not the explanation you're looking for. So what we've learned today is that science fantasy is sci-fi in a Gandalf suit. It's Gandalf on a spaceship. It's a little of column A, fantasy. It's a little of column B, sci-fi. There are no bad tropes. There are only bad handlings of tropes. And at the end of the day, you should create a universe that excites you, that is in some way unique, and you should just go and write some damn amazing world building and some great novels and some great campaigns and just throw them out to the world because we need more sci fantasy.
Yes,
right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Good. All right. Well, I think we've made progress today, children. Well done. Thank you, everybody who tuned in today in the chat. Lots of people wanting lightsabers in the chat. I agree. I want one too. A Vorpal blade would do. I'm not fussy.
I'm not picky.
Right. Exactly. Lots of Sharon Beatty says this has been so helpful, and I agree. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. You are amazing.
My pleasure. Anytime you ever want to chat, just let me know. I'm happy to come in.
Love you. Why don't you tell the lovely boys and girls where everybody can find you and what you're busy with?
My main site is chrisfoxwrites.com. These days, the more popular one is magitechchronicles.com. If you want to know more about me, Google either Chris Fox or just the single word Magitech, and I should pop up, and you can take a look at what I'm working on.
That is badass. Guys, not only is Chris a $1 million grossing self-publishing author, he also gives this knowledge away. You can buy books about how to do what he does successfully on his website, chrisfoxwrites.com. I think they're also available on Amazon and Kindle and wherever good books are sold. And he is, of course, an Anvilite as well and part of our family. We are very proud to have him. I would like to thank Secondhand Samurai for being completely epic and helping me with throwing out links, moderating, and doing all those good things. Thank you so much, Secondhand Samurai. For the subs, Miller Diamond. For the follows, I shall have to put my glasses on again because my screen is really far away. And sorry that my eyes will disappear. Andy Raven, General Cross, Talin Fiedelmader, Gord McLeod, Sleepy_Gary, and Max01, Matches, Patrick Lee Presents, and Craven2004, and for the hosts, Laura Bones. Guys, you are all fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going on a raid. So if you would like to join us, we are going to go talk to the great Game Master, Guy Sklanders, from the How to Be a Great GM channel. He is an award-winning Game Master, a screenwriter, a lecturer, and a world builder, and he is going to be world building on World Anvil, doing all sorts of cool stuff with the artist Kaora, who drew this map, among other things. So it should be an amazing threesome. Stay on Twitch if you are on Twitch, and you will be carried there, or go to Great GM Live over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/GreatGM Live, where you will find him live right now. And our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. So shout that out in the chat when you get there so that he knows that we sent you. All right, I think that's all for now. So you beautiful beans, stay safe, look after each other, grab your hammer, and go world build. It's flying dragons in space, people. It's what we need.